Good afternoon. Today we'll be presenting on a paper, Prenatal Diethylstilbestrol Exposure and Risk of Breast Cancer. So this study sought to investigate the link between diethylstilbestrol, or DES, exposure in utero and breast cancer rates later on in life. Previous studies of this relationship had found no strong correlation. However, the problem with that is that the sample size was of women who were younger than the age range where breast cancer usually shows up, just due to when DES was prescribed. So the investigators hypothesized that due to a number of other studies that have linked DES to cancer, they would find a positive correlation between the cancer rate and DES exposure. So, a little bit of background. As you guys saw in your text, the sex hormones are vital to prenatal development. Usually we focus on androgens because those tend to have a bit more of a directive effect on sexual differentiation, but estrogen also does play a vital role. And exposure to anything other than the optimal balance of these hormones can cause consequences ranging from very minor to very severe. These can also include effects from chemicals that just mimic the sex hormones, and not the sex hormones themselves, such as DES. So what is DES? DES is a synthetic estrogen. It was first synthesized in 1938, and in 1941 was approved by the FDA for treatment of vaginitis, which is inflammation and itching in the vagina, menopausal symptoms, and also for lactation suppression. As you can see here, this is an ad that you probably remember from your text for DES for the treatment of miscarriages. And it was first prescribed by doctors for this starting in the mid-40s off-label, and the FDA actually approved it for this purpose in 1947, along with treatment of preeclampsia, which some of you might know is hypertension caused by pregnancy. Unfortunately, the story of DES is a tragic one. Even as early as 1953, studies were performed doubting the efficacy of DES. A study performed at the University of Chicago in the early 50s found that it actually provided no significant benefit in terms of preventing miscarriages or premature births. But it wasn't until 1971 when a landmark study was performed, finding a very solid link between DES and a very rare cancer in children. Adenocarcinoma of the vagina is usually only present in women aged 50 or above. However, numerous teen girls were presenting in Boston hospitals with this very rare cancer. The investigation in 1971 found that 8 out of 9 girls who presented with it had been exposed to DES in utero. This is the first sign that DES was a carcinogen, and the FDA immediately banned it for use in pregnant women. However, it still was prescribed for other causes, and as time went on, more and more studies came out linking DES to various cancers and birth defects. This ranged from lesions in the vaginas of the girls who were exposed to it in utero, up to breast cancer in the mothers who actually took it. And we know that sex hormones have their greatest effect on the organs with the most receptors, and in that case, that is the reproductive system. That can be both the genitals as well as the mammary tissue, which is what we're interested in this case. So the investigators in this study asked, if it appears to be linked with breast cancer in the mother, and we know that it has this effect on the reproductive system, what about breast cancer for those who were exposed in utero? So the methods of this study, although the mass use of this was tragic, over 2 million people were exposed to DES in utero, it does provide us with a very good learning opportunity and sort of a large-scale human experiment. So this study actually tracked over 4,800 women who were exposed to DES in utero and compared them to a little over 2,000 control women who were not exposed to DES. Now, these were gathered from previous studies that had looked at various effects of DES exposure in utero, and the follow-up started in 1978 and actually continued all the way up to 2001. The women were in their mid-20s when it started, both the control and the exposed, and they were given questionnaires in 1994, 1997, and 2001. The results, unfortunately, the investigators were correct. As you can see, starting out, the trends are pretty similar. There's no significant difference between those who were exposed to it in utero and those who weren't. But right around when we reach the mid-40s, which is when breast cancer is usually first appearing in women, you see the trends kind of diverging. Those who were exposed end up at a rate almost twice that of the unexposed. Quick caveat, the y-axis here is cumulative hazard, which means at this age, if you've survived to this age, what is the likelihood that you will get breast cancer? And I want you to pay attention to the units here. This is in percent. So when you see 0.02, that's 0.02%. These are very small numbers. Out of the 4,800 people who were exposed, they only saw 76 cases of breast cancer. So this study, although it was performed very rigorously and the questionnaire itself was good, the sample size is still small. You know, we're talking about numbers in 2 orders of magnitude smaller than the actual sample size. Just have a look at the results. I'm going to break this down really quick. I want you to focus first on this category and on the right column. So we see here, this is the subjects broken down by the dosage of DES that they received. So you have low dose and high dose. This is unknown. It's not very relevant to our concerns right now. On the right you see age-adjusted IRR. Now IRR stands for incident rate ratio. And essentially what that is it takes the incident rate of those who were exposed to DES in utero and divides it by the incident rate of those who were not exposed. So you basically get a factor for how much effect DES has on the cancer rates. So we see here, those who were given a low dose in utero have an IRR of about 1.63, which means they are about 1.63 times as likely as those who were not exposed to get breast cancer at some point in their life. You see with the high dose, it's 2.17. This is a significant trend. The higher the dosage of DES, the greater the likelihood that the women would develop breast cancer later on in life. The other part of the results that are interesting is the weeks of gestation at the first exposure. As you can see here, those who were exposed to DES very early on actually have a lower IRR than those who were exposed later during their pregnancy. There isn't a good explanation for this, but one of the hypotheses is that it has to do with how developed the fetus is, because the mechanism for how this works, which I'll go over in just a second, has to do with the amount of estrogen receptors in the organs. So here's the most widely accepted mechanism. DES has been shown to have a regulatory effect over stem cells in mammary tissue. And in that effect, it's usually seen to have a upregulating positive effect on the stem cells. The more stem cells you have in the mammary tissue, the more likely it is that one of them could become cancerous and therefore develop into a breast cancer. So you see DES is going to increase the amount of stem cells, which can increase the risk of cancer. So what's the significance of all this? We know that the development in utero is very sensitive, and the body's responsiveness to sex hormones is very finely tuned, which means that if humans create chemicals that can mess with this balance, we can see a disruption that can have minor to severe consequences in our later development. Some of you may be thinking, well, this was back in the 40s, the 50s, we didn't have the kind of scientific testing and rigor that we do today. But we actually see very similar cases, even just a few years ago. You may remember BPA, bisphenol A, the chemical that was used in water bottles. That's very similar to DES, and that is an estrogen agonist. It does not have the same kind of severe effects that DES does, but it does still mirror that case. And the lessons that we've learned from DES helped us act quickly with BPA. So looking forward, we do have to be mindful of the chemicals that we're producing. Many of them can have an effect on the developmental pathway, especially if they mimic sex hormones like DES. This study unfortunately provided a cautionary tale, but we did learn that DES has been linked to increased rates of breast cancer in those who are exposed prenatally. Thank you.